In this video, I want to go over some other basic information that'll help you understand the game just a little bit better. So here I have all the pieces aligned in order, and I just want to go over the piece abbreviations that'll be used in your notation. And while I do that, I'll also go over the piece values. Let's just start with the king. So the king is abbreviated as K, and its value is infinite, because if you take the king, you win the game. The next piece is the chariot, which is abbreviated as the letter R because will be taken by the cannon, which we'll go over next. And the chariot is the most valuable piece in the game. It's valued as a 9. This is because of its ability to go across the board very quickly and in the most straightforward manner. It can't be blocked unlike other pieces. So the chariot is a very valuable piece. Now let's move over to the cannon, which is abbreviated as a C, and this is valued as a 4.5. After that is the horse, abbreviated as H, and that's valued as a 4. So these values are very close to each other, and they're actually very, very similar to the knight and bishop pair in chess, where they also have very close values, and they basically serve the same function. For those familiar with chess, the knight gets weaker towards the end of the game relative to the bishop. Towards the end of the game, the bishop has more open squares and it becomes a more valuable piece. There's a similar dynamic between the cannon and the horse here. In the beginning of the game, the cannon is more powerful because it has a lot of pieces that it can use to jump over, whereas the horse is actually very blocked in the beginning of the game, and so it's not as valuable. In the end game, you should definitely value the horse more than the cannon because there are few pieces to jump over for the cannon, but the horse has the freedom to go anywhere. So that's the cannon and the horse, very closely ranked pair. The next two pieces, the elephant and the advisor, their abbreviations are just the first letter in their names, and they're also both rated the same. So they're both rated with a value of 2, which is very low, and that makes sense. They're both very limited pieces. They are restricted on the board, and they're purely defensive pieces. And with that said, you should not really take them lightly either, because once they're connected, it's hard to take them down. So they do have value. It's just a low value. And then finally, we have the pawn or soldier. The pawn in its starting position is worth a lowly 1. It's the most basic piece. However, remember that the pawn can also move sideways once it crosses the river, and once it does, it's worth 2 points. But even at 2 points, once the pawn crosses the river, it's now one of your attacking pieces, and so it should be taken pretty seriously. Okay, next we'll talk about notation. For starters, we'll be using the World Xiangqi Federation notation, which is the most common notation used by Xiangqi players around the world. And this is very much different than that used by Western chess or even shogi. So for starters, you don't see the typical coordinate system that you see in chess or shogi. For example, in chess, you would see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to denote the ranks and files. Instead, all you see here are numbers labeling the files on both sides, and that's it. Notation in Xiangqi is based purely on the files, and here you can see on red side, it starts at 1 on the right and goes up to 9 on the left. But then for black, in their perspective, it starts from their 1 on the right and goes to 9 on their left. So it's just a rotationally mirror image of what they see. So for this example here, red's cannon is on file 2, but black's cannon is also on file 2. Again, it's just based on the perspective of the player that's moving. The other thing about notation in Xiangqi is that it's based off the piece's starting location, whereas other notation systems depend on where the piece is moving to. So, for example here, this elephant is labeled as being on file 5, so we say E5. And the final step of the notation is to describe how it moves. So in this case, let's say we want to move the elephant up here. We want to give a symbol to say that it's going up towards the enemy player. So the elephant is E5 plus 7. So the 7 means it's E5, elephant on file 5, moving to file 7. So for most pieces, you just say the name of the piece, what file it's on, is it going up or down, and then what's the end destination, what's the end file that it's going to be on. So this is E5 plus 7. If you want to go this way, this is E5 minus 7 because it's going backwards. And then likewise, if you're going to its other two movements, in this case, it'll be e5 minus 3. And then finally, e5 plus 3. It's going up to file 3. Now for the advisor, it's another diagonal piece and it moves exactly the same way. So for example, this is a5 plus 4. It's moving from file 5 to file 4. The horse, even though it's not a diagonal piece, it works the exact same way. So there are 8 spots the horse can go to, and they're all identified in the same form of notation. So example, if you want to move the horse here, well, it's going backwards, it's going towards you, so this is h5 minus 7. And then let me just put another enemy horse, for example. If that horse is also going backwards, to them it's h5 minus 6. So these two moves are h5 minus 6, h5 minus 6. That's how they'll be notated. So that covers all the pieces that don't move orthogonally. What about the pieces that do move orthogonally? So the chariot is the most basic piece. When you're moving side to side, again, it's the same rule. So if this chariot is going to move over to there, it's moving from file 5 to file 8. So this is R5, it's chariot on file 5, equals 8. So equals means it's sideways movement. You may also see this notated as a period. Equals period, they're the same thing. So R5 dot 8, R5 equals 8, same thing. And again, moving to the right, this would be R5 equals 3. So again, starting file, destination file. Fairly straightforward. Now let's talk about moving up and down. And this is where the exception is. When a piece is moving up or down and staying on the same file, so you can't use the destination file as its final coordinate. Instead, if this chariot moves up 2, then you just say R5 plus 2. Likewise, if it goes down here, this is R5 minus 3. So plus 2 minus 3 just means it's going up 2 or going down 3. For a lot of pawns, they'll be following a similar notation. So this is a pawn on file 7. And when you move it up, first move in the game, that'll be P7 plus 1. This is P7 plus 1. And then so on, P7 plus 1, P7 plus 1. Here it's P7 equals 6. Okay, finally, what about ambiguous cases? So in this position over here, we have two chariots on file 7. If we say R7 plus 1, what does that mean? Well, we don't know. So to differentiate between the two chariots, you instead of saying file 7, you say R plus referring to this one that's in front versus R minus. So minus means the chariot that's behind. So this is R plus, R minus. So if I wanted to move this one over here, that's R plus equals 8. So that means the chariot that's in front moves over to file 8. Or if I wanted to move it up by 1, that's R plus plus 1. If I wanted to move this down here, this is R plus minus 1. If I wanted to move this up here, this is R minus plus 1. Same thing can happen with pawns. So again, in this case, this is P plus plus 1. And then finally, what if you have the very, very rare situation where you have more than 2 pawns in the same file? In that case, then you have to change the notation just a little bit more. Instead of calling these P, you instead label them as 1, 2, and 3. So the frontmost one is called 1, and then everything is just increasing number after that. And so this is pawn on file 3. So this is the first pawn on file 3. And if it moves over this way, the notation is 1, 3 equals 2. So that means the first pawn on file 3 moves over to file 2. This is 2, 3 equals 4. This is 3, 3 equals 4. And then this movement, so again, this pawn moving up 1, is 1, 3 plus 1. Again, super rare situation. Let's talk about the opening and some very basic principles. So the most common opening for red would be the central cannon. So that's moving one of these cannons to the central file. Typically we'll say C2 equals C5 over here. This is a very good move because not only does it control the file that the king is on, but it also immediately threatens to attack this pawn over here. So what is the standard response for black? Most commonly, black would move up his horse, and then now this horse protects that pawn. The next move from red would be to move this pawn up, so C or P7 plus 1. And the reason for this is if you notice the horse's position over here, it's blocked by one of its own pawns. So if this horse tries to move out over here, it can't go any further because the pawn blocks these two spots over here. And so what red is doing is containing the horse. So that actually brings me to a good point about pawns, is that most of the time, a lot of Western chess players like to just push pawns uh, for development, but really that's not the case for Xiangqi. Pushing pawns doesn't really do anything. They're not very valuable in that sense. Their main value is just controlling the riverbank and preventing other pawns from coming up. So in this case, this pawn over here and then this pawn over here in the third and seventh files are very good at controlling horses because the horses typically move to those same files. And if red managed to get this pawn up too, that frees up his horse over there. And then likewise, the central pawn, that's something that you typically do not want to advance because once that pawn is advanced, it loses the protection of the horse that was over there. And now nothing can protect this pawn, so in most cases, I would not recommend advancing the central pawn. So that brings me to the next point of how you should consider the opening is to always develop your pieces, and you especially want to develop your chariots as they're your most powerful piece. So let's make a few more moves over here. Say red moves his horse over here, and black does that. Very good move for red over here would be to move his chariot in file 1 over here. And then now he controls this file. So controlling files is very important in Xiangqi. As you'll notice, there are many open files. So this is typically open after the cannons move away. These files are open. And then likewise, this is another open file, basically anything that doesn't have a pawn in it. And so having this cherry here gives it a lot of flexibility. It can move up to the riverbank, or it could start immediately threatening the pawn line of the opponent. So that's a very good move. On the other side, to develop that chariot, you could also consider moving this one up over here. And now you have freedom to move anywhere in this rank. And ideally, you want to move this over to the 4th or 6th ranks over here. And if the enemy does not respond, now you're in deep territory, and now you control their back, or their second to last back rank, which is very powerful. And then finally, that brings me to my third point about overall game flow, is that it's important to block pieces. Xiangqi is very positional, and in some cases, blocking a piece is good as killing it. So for example, if I manage to get this chariot over to this spot over here, black's horse is stuck. It can't go anywhere. And on top of that, his chariot over here can't develop very well. It could maybe try to go here, but it's very cumbersome. So having good positional play means locking down as many as of your opponent's pieces as possible while developing your own. Some other things you might want to consider is if the elephant defense is too strong, you can also try blocking the linkage between these two elephants. So now they don't cover each other because of that chariot, or even any other piece like a cannon could block that. And now in the future, these elephants are exposed and can be picked off. Finally, I just wanted to briefly discuss endgames. If you wanted to study Xiangqi, most of the important material is in the endgames, not so much the openings. The openings are very straightforward. There's the most common central cannon opening like I mentioned, and then several responses to that, as well as a few variations. And it's not nearly as in-depth as it is in Western chess. However, the endgames is full of different situations that you have to be aware of. And one thing I just want to suggest for new players is keep in mind that even with low material, it's still very, very easy to mate because the enemy king is still trapped within his palace, and the king can only move one square orthogonally. That means it's not the same kind of challenge as mating a king in Western chess. On top of that, your king also acts as an additional chariot because he attacks the king on any open file, and typically in the endgame, files are more open. So very, very common mating pattern, like I mentioned in the rules video, is just simply if you have one chariot, you can control two files, and this is checkmate over here. This cannon attacks the general or king over there, and then this king prevents the escape. And in many simple pieces, even one pawn or one horse can deliver mate, as long as you coordinate with your king. So for example, let me give you the situation over here. You can deliver mate here. So if it's red's turn to move, he can move his horse up to check the king. The king can move either up or down. Again, he can't move to the side because of your king. So let's say he moves this way. Now look, the king can't move on his turn. He can't go here and he can't go there because of the king and the horse. So he's stuck. So your next move just has to be a simple filler move like k5 plus 1. And now this is mate because it's stalemate. Black can't move and it's victory. So those were some basic Xiangqi tips. I'll leave you to figure out the rest on your own.